so using from a few episodes ago, that framework of origin, purpose, meaning, and destiny as a way to look at really almost any subject. How can we look at this? So the best place to start is that question: where did work come from? Because I think there is a conception sometimes, in Christianity especially, that work is a punishment. You hear that a lot, that we have to toil, which I'll get to in a second, but that the idea that, man, I'm taking what they're giving because I'm working for a living, or, Johnny Paycheck in the 70s, take this job and shove it, or that my whole job is to one day make enough money so that I never have to work again. So that the point of work is to work enough so that you don't have to work.
And I mean, that feels like the cycle. But I mean,
Right.
it's funny because I can even think back to the garden. Adam and Eve, they get done. God says that you will work the land. Like that is it. It's almost like even then God was giving it as a punishment because they got to just kind of chill in the garden all the time. Like they just hung out and like named things.
Yeah, but see, that's where we understand work comes from before the fall of man.
Yeah.
Work is really established in the garden. Genesis chapter 1, around verse 26 and going on into 31, God gives them jobs. He says, be fruitful and multiply and tend these things that I've given. So the idea of work as punishment is not, there is a form of work that is a blessing from God. There is a form of work that is a gift from God. There is maybe not a form, that's probably not the word. There is an aspect of work that is a gift from God, and that could be, that begs another question, which is why or how, and we can get to that in a second. But you see that both in the opening account in creation, which is Genesis 1, which is a poem about creation. It's a song about creation. And then Genesis 2 is the story about creation. And in both of those, God says, your task, I'm going to give you things that are meaningful to you. Meaning for you to be involved in, meaningful for you. And so we can at least say that like everything else God did before the fall of man, he created it and it was good. Then we have, and you can go back a few episodes if you want, to the we broke it moment, which is it gets corrupted. So we have this thing that's established, perfect, good, valuable, worthy. And even if you're not maybe a quote unquote a Christian, or you're not a believer, you're not a person of faith, you say, well, I don't know if I believe that. And yet all of us, regardless of our faith background, have a satisfaction that comes from doing something right, or there can be a satisfaction or a dignity that comes from work. We as Christians would say that's the remnant of that intended created state. What happens then is it gets corrupted in the fall of man. And that's where the famous passage in Genesis 3 comes from. And I can read it here because I like to get my Bible out.
I actually really appreciate...
I have to take my glasses off.
But
go ahead.
I actually really appreciate that you actually physically open. It's funny because, I mean, you can tell the difference, and we'll talk a little bit about me a little later on, but as somebody who deals with tech, I've got the Bible on my thing, but like there's just something about turning the pages and holding it sometimes that feels real. I don't know.
Maybe we do
a complete segue, but it's just I see them
ASMR
so rarely
of like Bible folding, but no, I don't know.
This is going to be a short. This is going to be a reel on Instagram.
Yeah.
You're just going to hear him flipping through the Bible.
That's right. I'm kind of
Probably a million views.
Genesis. Wouldn't that be ironic? Right?
You never know.
Yeah,
That'll be the one that goes viral.
The episode gets like 1.2, maybe like 800 views, but me flipping pages gets like 8 million.
That's the way it works.
And before I know it, I'm a BuzzFeed article. All right. Genesis chapter 3, verse 17. And to Adam, this is God, said, because you have listened to the voice of your wife and you have eaten the tree of which I've commanded, you shall not eat it. Cursed is the ground because of you.
Yep.
In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you. You shall eat the plants of the field. So in other words, the cycle of multiplying, cultivation, being fed out of creation, relying on creation, that's going to continue. But by the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground. For out of it you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you will return. So this idea then that work, which is meant to we get to the purpose of it. At the very least, let's show you the very minimal purpose of work is to sustain. Okay, that still continue, but it goes from work to toil. It goes from this harmonious I don't want to say balance, but let's just say this harmonious, synergistic, everything kind of works, maybe even effortless. That's one way of looking at it. Yielding to now it's like, oh man, this is work now. And if I'm going to have bread, which is, bread's this massive metaphor in the Old Testament for life and sustenance and all that kind of stuff. If I'm going to have bread, I'm going to have to work for it. Even now work becomes a counterproductive. So I have to put effort into restoring myself. And so that's really where it comes from.
It blows my mind because...
And that's where it breaks down, I guess, would be the way of looking at it.
But it blows my mind because it's funny, when I was going through and prepping for this episode, that verse that you just read was the first time that I had considered that the mention of work. But that's, like you had already mentioned, it actually has been said before.
Yeah.
They were doing other things.
They were doing things.
God had given them commandments to do things. And there was so... The fact, I think the part that I'm trying to differentiate is, like, you've talked about toil and all this other thing, but when we're talking about, when we're here today, is that more driven by Genesis 3, or is it more driven by earlier on when God was asking us to just, do things?
Yeah, so yes. I mean, the answer is yes. Like everything.
That's
Yes, so profound.
I don't even know how to deal with that.
No, I mean, think about it.
Okay.
What I mean by that is there is an interior part of us. Now, this is something I truly, deeply believe, and I think there are arguments in the Bible that says that there's a part of us that spiritually, I was going to use a big word, metaphysically, but let's just use the word spiritually, that spiritually sort of remembers the way it should have been.
Okay.
So we take pride in our work. There are things that we enjoy doing. There are certain work that all of us enjoy doing. I'm not very good at it, but I actually really do like to work on my car. Like I said, I'm not good at it, but I like to do it. I like to build things that aren't just Legos, but I like to build, I like to do things, right? And all of us have these things that we do. So that's part of that Genesis 1 and 2. That's this longing and this fulfillment, this dignity, this sense of purpose and meaning that come from doing a job well done or doing anything. The corruption part is we are now beholden to it. The only way I'm going to get the bread is by the sweat of my face. And that's the cycle, according to Genesis 3, right, that he says, this is how it's going to be. Genesis 3, by the sweat of your face, 19, you shall eat the bread till you return to the ground. And that's it. And I think that's how a lot of people watching, listening, engaging probably feel about work. That I'm going to, by the sweat of my face, just get enough to survive, and then I'm going to die. And that's life. And so there's a part that says that feels wrong. And the only reason it feels wrong is because there's a part of us that remembers how it's supposed to be. That God's intended fabric of reality, that shalom that we've talked about on the podcast before, that there was the intended way, and then there is now the reality. That's just how the world works now. But both we carry both in our being. When
you guys did episode 1, at the very beginning, you actually talked about, you were talking about day traders versus this woman who worked at McDonald's, which if you guys want to check that episode out, you can check it out right here. There's a link. You should go watch it just to get some understanding of what I'm saying. There is this idea that we can, in our work as it was given in Genesis 3, still have, in a lot of ways, that Zen state, that person who is fulfilled in their role or their job or whatever it was. Where does that piece that person at McDonald's versus the day trader, where does that come from in our work and purpose?
Well, I think when we talk about the origin, we talk about the idea of, it's created in the garden, so we have this remnant of it. It's corrupted in the fall. And then what we see now is really, that's why you have to understand the whole idea of the gospel. You really do. Now, believe it or not, yes, it really does come down to the gospel. It comes down to Jesus fixing, or what one of the theological phrases is the restoration of all things. That's part of the fixing that Jesus does. And that we can live, even now, in our physically limited, broken, sinful reality that we all live in, we can tap into the restored reality of the future. You say, what do you mean by that? I can live with a perspective of things being restored for all eternity, of things getting back to the way they were. And because I believe in Jesus and because the gospel has entered my life and his salvation has entered my life, I can live off of that future reality now. And what that means is I can now, because of what Jesus has done, understand what was going on in the garden. And I can say my job can have that too, regardless of what it is. But then I have to understand the purpose. So we said earlier, where did it come from? So this brings up sort of one of those other key questions we ask. We ask about origin. We ask about purpose about anything. What is the point of work?
And I am really looking forward to the answer to this because when you think about job, when you think about what we do, in a lot of ways, it's one of those things that people use to define us. It's not supposed to, but it does, right? Like we define ourselves in what we do, right? Even though you said you build Legos, if you were a and by the way, I really apologize to all of the AFOLs out there or Lego. We understand the plural of Lego is Lego, right?
Yes.
So I'm sorry that we said Legos.
I believe it's actually Lego bricks.
I know, which we have had this argument before.
Yeah, we've had this conversation
which is even
offline.
a whole other thing. But I just want to protect the sanctity of our nerddom here and all that sort of stuff.
Yes.
But when we think about how purpose is defined, right? Like our job is like the majority of what we do. Mm-hmm. So how did that purpose come to be?
Well, you really tapped on it because what happens is rather than asking what is the purpose of work in my life, we tend to ask, how is my purpose defined by my work? So that's what we do. So we consider, particularly in the United States and in the West, we measure someone's value to society by how well or how often they contribute to it based on the work that they do. So what we do is then we tend to say this is a good job and this is a bad job.
Yes.
Or this is a job that brings value or this is a worthless job. It doesn't bring value. But that makes society or your personhood the center of all of it. So how do I know I have a good job? Well, now let's start going down the list. How do I know I have a good job? Okay, well, it pays me.
Yep.
Right? But really the only idea of getting paid a lot is so one day I don't have to do the job anymore.
Right.
So a job should be so good that I don't have to do it one day. I mean, that's this weird way that we look at it. I'm talking about in terms of like a secular, non-religious,
right?
in general.
I will say that there are people who like, we're going to segue in a really bad way in some of the, but it's like there are people who are like, I love my job so much I never want to quit. Right?
And
there is a whole thing.
And that's a little bit,
but you're not wrong. Like for most people,
that's a little bit of that Genesis 1 bleeding in.
Right.
Now there's something else. I've managed to tap into something else about work and purpose and toil and effort that is more true to what it should be.